I thank the honourable guest for their speech. And now I look to Richard Brooks to close the case for the proposition side. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you very much. My honourable friends in this hall today, thank you very much for having me. It's a genuine pleasure. The last time as a NUS officer I was on Oxford University campus, a student came up to me and said something very serious, and they said that, Richard, you are an ISIS sympathiser. And I turned and I looked at them and I said, I just don't think it's fair that the blues get all of the attention, to be honest with you. They told me to tell boat jokes. I'm not sure if that was right. All right, free speech, we'll go. With that matter dealt with, let's go to the motion at hand. I don't believe that this debate fundamentally is one of free speech versus anti-free speech. This is simply as what you would define as who has the freest of speech. Some people on the other side of the debate, thankfully not the speakers that we've heard so far, believe that you can literally say anything to anyone without care in the world for the consequences. Let's call it Trump talk. Trump talk argues that you can say whatever you want to whomever you want, including when it comes to grabbing, I can't swear in here, can I? I mean, my mum's probably going to watch this after, grabbing something. But when it comes to his vice president receiving a mild lecture from the cast of Hamilton, then he invokes a safe space. For the rest of us, I think we can all agree that all of us draw our own internal lines, as reasonable beings about what is and what isn't publicly acceptable. The reality is that some of those sat opposite me, their version of freedom of speech is to advantage certain groups over others. Ours is about equalising that inequity. Most will recognise that this is a matter of degrees, as we've heard from the opposition speakers so far. That creating an environment that everyone can engage is challenging but absolutely worthwhile. A safe space is simply a place where people can come together to debate and discuss in a way that enfranchises everyone, not a select few. That is simply it. Dangerous ideas absolutely have a place in education. Oppression does not. And there is a long tradition in liberal thinking of freedom, going all the way back to John Stuart Mill, and I'm glad that a previous speaker spoke of John Stuart Mill's harm rule, actually. Simply put, your freedom should only extend so far as to when it encroaches upon others. Everyone can use the long written quotes of liberal thinkers to further their own points here, but surely that must prove that there are multiple freedoms at stake. Let's be clear about this. A debate where you have groups of people that preach violence and fascism and hate to the point where it generally puts people in fear of their safety is not a debate at all. And I'm acutely aware that on this and on many other things, students and activists stand on the shoulders of giants. Peter Tatchell in particular, my honourable opposition, is a hero to many in my generation. We know the struggle that he went through, and I'm certain that my honourable friends involved in activism in their youth, in this hall and outside, were condemned by previous generations for their activism. I would ask them to reflect upon this. So the second part of my argument is actually what's happening on university campuses, because we've heard all sorts of things said tonight. Well, students' unions are recognising that free and open debate, as has been historically defined by society, isn't necessarily as free and open as one would be believed. That public forums and debates are often geared towards those from certain backgrounds with certain experiences. Those who are resistant to this change are very quick to pick out the most extreme cases they can find and hold them up as evidence that students have lost the actual plot. This simply is not true, and in many cases, the truth has been wildly exaggerated. And if you were to read the Daily Mail or any other example, you would simply believe that democracy itself was at death's door. Let's look at the list of speakers who have supposedly been banned on campus, right? Jermaine Greer spoke at Cardiff. Mariam Nawazi debated at Warwick. Katie Hopkins, who despite having no platform to sell from this debate to go and cover an election that finished 5 days ago, has spoken in the other house only last week. Imogen Wilson, as Peter Tatchell has mentioned, a person misused a process, that process was struck down, and the debate continued undeterred. This tidal wave of attack of free speech where students are wild hordes wandering around campus, batting copies of The Sun out of people's hands and attacking people for saying things they disagree with simply doesn't exist. Analysis by Change SU showed that of 50 students' unions surveyed last year, not one of them banned a speaker. So despite what Spikes may say for criticising universities and students' unions for having bullying and harassment policies, freedom of speech is alive and well, as exemplified tonight. Now, do I personally agree with every single decision that's been made in every single students' union across the country? Of course not. I think the students' unions are at the forefront of progressive change, and universities are, and they are trying something that hasn't been done before, and we're experimenting. And of course, they will sometimes make decisions to wider society that will seem off kilter. When individual cases are picked out and amplified or exaggerated, this distracts from what is actually happening on campuses as has been defined tonight, and that students' unions and universities are leading the way in redefining what healthy debate looks like. They are opening up debate to those who have been previously shut out. And let's acknowledge that people from certain educational backgrounds will have more experience in debating in forums like this. Let's acknowledge that a debate about rape, for example, might be easier to engage with for someone who has publicly claimed that rapists should be treated as victims than it would be for a survivor of sexual assault who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. This is what universities and student unions are recognising. They're examining the traditional idea of what free speech and open debate should look like, and they're acknowledging that change needs to be made in order to truly open up the conversations to each and every single one of us. So why the outrage? If nothing's happening, why is everyone so annoyed? A cursory reading of any broadsheet or red top newspaper would tell you, as I said before, that democracy itself was in peril. But if I was to explain that not much of consequence has happened, then why the furore? And I think it's because the last half century in particular has been a story of the onward progression of civil and social rights, and in particular the rights of those who have been previously oppressed. This debate is about freedom of speech, safe spaces, and trigger warnings can't just be seen in isolation. There are people on the opposing side who are seen to be foot soldiers of a pushback. Their goal is for wider society to shift the goalpost to back to where they were in the 1950s or the 1970s, if you read the Daily Mail today, under the cover of political correctness gone mad. They would recreate a world where it's okay again to openly abuse those on the street and mock minorities and ultimately roll back those hard-won gains. Nobody fought for those advances harder than, in particular, my honourable opposition Peter Tatchell himself. And it's very difficult for me, actually, as a long-term admirer of Peter Tatchell, someone who I wrote about very favourably in my dissertation, as he notes, someone who carries the scars on his back for the progress we take for granted, to be sat on the opposite side of a debate to him. And I would ask people, Peter, and those who consider themselves progressive on the other side of this debate, to look at who you're sat next to. Look at whose arguments and interests you are supporting. Katie Hopkins, that's whose chair you have taken in this debate. Every decent person in this room must acknowledge that racism and sexism and homophobia are not okay. And we acknowledge that debate is a freedom, hard one, and that the best ideas are often the most dangerous. But the right to verbally abuse someone, to intimidate, and to oppress them and to make them feel unsafe is simply not the same as Newton saying that the world is spherical. And we must acknowledge that students and student unions and universities will continue to advance ideas ahead of the mainstream curve. And that more often than not, we are all vindicated 20 years down the line in the pub. So I urge you all to vote for this proposition, not because you necessarily vote for everything that my proposition side have said, nor because you dislike certain politics of those against us, but surely that we must acknowledge now that freedom of speech is not under threat, that debate is flourishing and alive and well, and that just because students are always going to try different and new things to enfranchise the previously unenfranchised, that does not represent the death knell of democracy. It simply makes Katie Hopkins slightly less relevant. Please vote for this proposition. Thank you very much.